So welcome to our first session of Lunch and Learn Summer 2022 series hosted by the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So today's presentation is going to be on building and supporting LGBTQIA plus pride and resilience. And I have a survey that I will post in the chat. At the end of today's presentation, you will also receive a reminder email to fill that out. But today we have Dr. Mickey White, NCC BC TMH, he, him, and he is an assistant professor of counseling at East Tennessee State University. His research agenda includes intersectionality and gender identity among trans individuals, the process of identity disclosure for LGBTQIA+ professionals, liberatory pedagogical approaches and counselor education, anti-racist identity development, and multiculturalism and social justice in counseling. He is a past emerging leader for both the Southern Association for Counselor Education and Supervision and the Society for Sexual, Affectional, Intersex, and Gender Expansive Identities. He is a member of the American Counseling Association's Gender Identity Task Force and is the Secretary-elect for SAGE. His personal and professional commitments to equity and inclusion stem from his own intersectional identities and on behalf of his past, present, and future clients, students, and supervisees. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mickey White.
Thanks, Audrey. It's always very weird to me to hear my bio be read. I don't know that that will ever not be weird to me. So welcome. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm really excited to be here. This is something that is really important to me, something that has been important to me both professionally and personally for quite a while. I want to invite you as we go through today. An hour is not a lot of time. I could talk about this stuff for hours. I have talked about this stuff for hours. So I'm going to try to really kind of narrow it in a little bit and talk specifically about kind of student and campus experiences to the degree that I can. So again, like Audrey said, I'm Dr. Mickey White. I'm in the counseling program and assistant professor. My pronouns are he, him, and I have been at ETSU since fall of 2019. So I got a good 6 months of Johnson City and ETSU and then got hit with the global pandemic. So in a lot of ways, it feels like I am just getting to know ETSU and getting connected to folks. So it's really exciting to be able to be here. To get started, I want to tell you a little bit about me. So why is this important? I'm a qualitative researcher by trade, so I do a lot of positionality statements in my writing and my research. And so I do positionality statements with my presentations as well. I identify as both queer and trans, and that is something that has shaped who I am as a professional in a myriad of different ways. It has led to kind of the formation of my research agenda. It's led to how I experience myself as an educator, how I experience myself as a counselor, and then the things that I'm really passionate about doing and the things that I'm really passionate about talking with students and with clients and with other folks about. So folks like you all today. I want to invite you. I've been teaching on Zoom for the past 2 years, so I've gotten pretty adept at it in a lot of ways. So I want to encourage you, as you feel comfortable, feel free to turn your camera on, toss stuff in the chat. If you want to ask questions or give comments, I can kind of follow along. I'm not going to do, I've got a presentation, but it's also not super formal. I really want to get some engagement from you all. And for the sake of time, I'm just curious. I want to give you an opportunity. Who are you? What brings you here today? Give an opportunity to let just a couple folks unmute if you'd like to share what drew you to this, and then feel free to pop it in the chat as well. What brought you to this? Other than me and my beautiful face, I understand that that's a draw in and of itself.
I can jump in.
Yeah, please, Joel.
So part of it was you and your beautiful face. Now, I made recognition. I thought, I know who that is. I had a class with them. I know it will be good stuff. And I identify as gay, and so it's a topic that's interesting to me as well, and I want to learn what I can about it. So I appreciate you doing this.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that. Casey says that they're a child and family clinician from ETSU MSW program. So ally and advocate and finding ways to support and advocate for those around you. That's awesome. That's an excellent reason to be here. Anybody else? Last call? Yeah, sorry. Tori, please.
I was just going to say, I'm joining the counseling program this fall. I think you're actually my advisor.
Excellent. Welcome.
I'm also currently planning my wedding, and my fiance and I are very stressed about the Supreme Court decisions and such because of how it may affect gay marriage and the fact that it may stop in Tennessee 9 days before our wedding. So that's a fun thing, but this is something I'm very interested in and hoping to get into. So
excellent. Well, thank you. And also feel free to, I'm sure you'll be receiving multiple emails from me as your advisor. So Ethan, near and dear to you as a trans man, thank you for disclosing yourself. Building community is important. And then Jesse, wanting to learn about how to be a good ally and advocate. And with, Director of Student Success for Clemmer, absolutely. That's a big ask, right? So what I'm going to focus on today, going to quickly review the basics. Okay, so just some general terminology, and then also kind of hone in specifically on LGBTQIA plus pride, resilience, and resistance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means today as well, and then ways to be an accomplice. So notice that I don't say ally here. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that. So kind of hold that in the back of your mind. It's something that was really taught to me and that has shaped a lot of the work that I do as well. So when we start off with the basics, what does LGBTQIA plus mean? A lot of you may be familiar with these terms. Some of you may not. There's always new terms emerging. So LGBTQIA plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, intersex, asexual, aromantic. And then the plus encompasses other identities and experiences, because our understanding as a culture, as a society, changes, and it has changed. It's changed really rapidly, especially with the advent and use of social media. A lot of folks are really being able to learn who they are because they have access now, access that didn't exist. We have terminology to fit experience. So one of the best examples of this back in like our original kind of gay rights movement that came across the US in the 60s and 70s were led by, at the face, they were actually led by trans women of color primarily, but at the face, it was lesbian and gay liberation and lesbian and gay rights. So you kind of had a choice. You were either heterosexual, or you were a lesbian woman, or a gay man. Those were kind of your options. But that's not how sexuality and affectional orientation and identity work. We know that people are attracted to folks across the spectrum. And Kinsey had a scale for that, right? So his 6-point scale of heterosexual to homosexual. And bisexuality existed, but we didn't talk about it. We didn't have words or language for that experience. So a lot of men identified as gay because they were attracted to men, but had to hide attraction to women, or didn't have the experience or the language to share that experience of being attracted to women and men. Lesbian women had a very similar experience and being attracted to both men and women. So bisexuality emerged as a term in the 80s and 90s. And that has really kind of shaped a lot of how we understand ourselves And then bisexuality was seen and has been seen as very limiting, very binary gender, right? So if you're somebody that's attracted to folks kind of regardless of gender, or you're attracted to all genders and not just men or women, then bisexual, as culturally we have understood it for a long time, wasn't really fitting. It wasn't something that made sense and was indicative of someone's identity. So then the term pansexual was developed. So pan being all or many, that your attraction is regardless of someone's gender expression or gender identity. Then we have asexuality and the spectrum of asexuality, and allosexual having what's considered quote unquote normal, right? I use that with a lot of cringe and a lot of air quotes, having sexual attraction, to asexual, which is not having sexual attraction, not experiencing sexual attraction, and then demisexual for folks that are attracted sexually to folks after they develop emotional attractions. So after they emotionally connect with someone, then experiencing sexual attraction. So there's a wide variety, and that's where that plus comes in to kind of encapsulate new and emerging identities instead of saying LGBT, LGBTQ, that's what we have. One note on here as well is we're seeing a lot more use of the word and the term queer. And that is, for a lot of folks, a political reclamation of identity. That's one of the reasons that I personally identify as queer, because it has a political reclamation, that it's a term that has been used against the LGBTQ plus community for many years. And it also encompasses how I see myself in both my gender identity and my sexual identity, that it can't be described in terms of gender itself, right? So can't be described as in I am X gender and attracted to XYZ ABC gender. It's just much more fluid than that. And then also has this piece of like, my existence is resistance, right? That's something that's been adopted by a lot of marginalized communities, primarily BIPOC communities, as like our existence is in fact liberating in and of itself, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But then some other acronyms you may come across that are important to know as well. If you see GE, that's going to primarily stand for gender expansive. Pansexual, of course, the P, and then two-spirit, which is a indigenous identity that's neither male nor female, or has both male and female components or other gender components, but is primarily relegated and should be relegated to indigenous individuals because it's a cultural understanding of gender. Q may also mean questioning. And then A, I put it in the previous slide of aromantic, but it may mean aromantic or agender as well. You may see some acronyms that have A be ally. You're not. If you identify as cisgender, if you identify as heterosexual, you're not part of that marginalized community of gender and sexual minority or marginalized folks. So that's something to be aware of in not co-opting spaces and not co-opting experience, and that you can absolutely be an ally and you can absolutely be an advocate and an accomplice. And part of being an ally, an advocate, an accomplice is not identifying yourself with the experiences of folks who experience discrimination and marginalization due to gender and sexual identity. So I want to toss that out there. I see also we have, if you've seen the ally flags, it's a black and white flag with a rainbow A on it. Don't buy that flag. If you want to be an ally, get the Pride Progress flag, which is this one over here. It has the rainbow. It has a black and a brown stripe to kind of honor and recognize our brown and black siblings that fight for equality and justice across multiple intersections, trans colors, and then also intersex. So I encourage you to use the progress flag instead of an ally flag. And then last but not least, in terms of just kind of some understanding, I love the gender unicorn. Some of you may have seen the genderbread person, which was used for quite a while. It did its job, but then the unicorn came out and is just more encompassing. It's more explorative. And it's also a unicorn, which is awesome. Unicorns are just wonderful. So the gender unicorn has a few different aspects to it that I think make it really important to explore identity and experience for LGBTQIA plus folks and also cisgender heterosexual folks. So everyone can use this to explore how they experience the world and how the world experiences them. And as a mental health professional, I use this with my clients quite a bit. The gender unicorn is available in multiple different languages, and they also have a coloring page and an interactive page online if you go to this transstudent.org/gender. So you see here gender identity. I love it because it's not just a binary going from one side male to the other side female. It has male, female, and other genders because gender is a cultural construct. And so it lets you identify yourself within these different spectrums. And then you have physical attraction and emotional attraction, which adds more inclusivity, particularly for folks who are asexual. And then sex assigned at birth has that intersex identity recognized as well. So if you're interested in learning more about the unicorn, I'm happy to talk more about it with you. I'll also have my contact info at the end of the slide or at the end of the PowerPoint. Before I kind of move into some more of the next stuff, I want to just touch base and see, does anybody have any questions or thoughts before I move forward? So there's a couple other folks in the chat that are excited to be here and wanting to support students and learn more, which is awesome. I'm glad y'all are here. So what about the history, right? So I always contextualize things. Anytime I'm teaching, anytime I'm doing a presentation, I love to add context to experience and understanding because I think it ends up making a lot of sense and it helps put things into perspective. There's a train of thought around that says, you know, LGBTQIA plus identities are new, particularly trans identities are new. And the reality is that they're not. We've been around forever. We've been around for millennia. So, and we not only have we been around for millennia, we have been around the world. We're globally recognized. And really globally celebrated prior to a lot of British colonization as well. So over here you see on this left-hand side at the top left, you have Hijras of India, which are a traditional third gender that used to be seen as leaders of communities, used to be really supported and engaged for advice and guidance. Again, prior to British colonization. You've got below that the Mushi of Mexico, which were celebrated on the cover of Vogue just a few years ago. You've got the Mahu of Hawaii in this middle top, and then Two-Spirit indigenous cultures, primarily of the North and South Americas in the bottom middle. And then you've got gay and lesbian and bisexual identities and queer identities all throughout history, represented over here on the right-hand side. Of course, I put Audre Lorde down here in the bottom right-hand corner, who is incredible, who's an incredible Black lesbian poet and writer and activist who did a ton of work. And you can find examples of queer experience. And I use the word queer in like an expansion, right? So not just lesbian or gay or bisexual, but really just not gender normative, outside, very gender expansive, gender creative, sexually expansive throughout history. We've got Roman era, we've got Greek era, we've got indigenous cultures, all have examples written and saved in art, examples of LGBTQIA plus identity and experience. So this is not new. What's new is that we have language and a lightning fast way to spread it. So we have the language to explain experience. Like I said earlier, we have that language, but we also have ways to share and ways to connect with community, which is really important. I know one of the things that was crucial in my understanding of myself was being able to connect with other people like me, being able to connect to other trans men and people that were experiencing themselves in a way that was similar to how I experienced myself. Being able to see myself represented in literature and in media that wasn't tokenizing or wasn't harmful or wasn't stereotypical, because we see a lot of stereotypes of queer and trans people that are very harmful. And as we move away from that, or as we have better representation, we start to be able to change the way we see ourselves and be able to change the way that the world sees us as well. For some really great examples of this that are very particular to the trans community, I highly recommend that you watch Laverne Cox's Disclosure, which is available on Netflix. That is one of the best representations of trans history in media that I have ever seen, and does a really great job of explaining it, and also the intersectionality of particularly the history of Black trans women within queer spaces. So I encourage you to watch that, because that gets us to this pride and resilience. So when you think of pride, what do you think of? What comes up for you when you think about like LGBTQIA pride or resilience? You can unmute yourself or pop it in the chat, either one. I'll give you a second.
I'll jump in if nobody
Please.
wants to. When I think of pride, I think it means being proud of who you are, what you stand for, and loving yourself for who you are.
I really like that. So standing, being proud of yourself and proud of what you stand for. I think that's really, really fitting. Thank you, Joe.
And I think for me, one thing I learned to appreciate as I've gotten older was that it's not about sex. It's more than that. And I mean, I'll say that there was a time, in my life that's I saw the difference was, but no, it's much deeper than that.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that, because I think you are speaking to some very common stereotypes that pride and particularly, I think, within gay male communities, the sexual aspect of it. But if you think about it, if you're having to hide who you are 90% of the time, and our culture also says that sex is how you connect to other people, then if you get the opportunity to connect with somebody, but you only have time to do it for sex, then that's what you're going to do, because you need that connection. As humans, we are built for connection and relationships and intimacy. But if you don't have the ability to have a relationship, then this is kind of your next best option. So I appreciate that. I see in the chat here, Susan says courage, and then Jesse, standing firm in your authentic self. Absolutely. It's that authenticity piece, I think also speaks to what Joe was saying of standing within yourself as well. Anybody else have any thoughts about pride or resilience? We talked about pride. What about resilience? What comes up for you there? This is where I've gotten really good at Zoom teaching and just doing the stare.
I think for me, resilience means it's connected to the word pride, because you don't let the noise and the distractions take away from who you are. So I think the words go really closely hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Casey, being who you are in the face of discrimination. So again, that like tying back in, being who you are and then continuing to be who you are even when it's challenged. And then Tori, existing in spite of those that try to silence us, as well as showing each other that we are not as alone as we sometimes feel. Beautifully said. And then Patricia, being able to spring back and keep growing despite adverse winds. I like metaphors, plant metaphors especially, right? Like we continue to stay rooted and continue to grow. So absolutely, you know, when I think of pride and when I think of resilience, I think of very similar things to what all of you have said. And I also specifically think about community and the importance of community, which I'll talk about here in a minute as well. So the ACLU, in one of their recent publications, had this quote that really stood out to me. So pride has never been just about the parties. To the LGBTQ plus community, pride is about staking our place in the world and speaking truth to power. It's about making clear that we're here, we belong, and we are resilient together. So that, I think, echoes a lot of what you all have said. And then also the piece that I really like about this is that staking our place in the world and speaking truth to power. So not just that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, but I'm here and I am seen, right? I am recognized and I am seen. I'm no longer hiding. I'm no longer trying to make myself smaller or make myself more quiet. I'm allowed to be loud, essentially. And I think that's really important and really fitting as we just have crossed the 7-year anniversary of the shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and how much I remember how heartbreaking it was that it was never really officially considered to be a hate crime or domestic terrorism, even though it was intentionally targeting a gay club, and a gay club that was primarily frequented by brown and black gay men as well. So we've got intersections of racism and heterosexism in there. And then with June being Pride Month in general, right? So does anybody know why June is Pride Month? Somebody's got to know why June is Pride Month.
I think Joe put it in the chat.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Joe. Yes, Stonewall. So the anniversary of Stonewall, June 28th, 1969 was the uprising at the Stonewall Inn. You see here on the right-hand side is Miss Major, Marsha P. Johnson, and Sylvia Rivera, and Stormy DeLaBray, who were really the catalysts to what we now consider, or what we have come to call, kind of the gay liberation movement or the gay pride movement. Miss Major, Sylvia Rivera, and Marsha P. Johnson are all trans women of color that also, particularly Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, were also advocates for sex worker rights and sex worker acceptance. They were trans women who also engaged in sex work and did not experience or did not adhere to the cultural narrative of shame that surrounds sex work and also surrounds trans identity. So Stonewall Inn, for those of you that aren't familiar, was a club in Greenwich Village in New York City. And for years before that, it had been open for at least a few years. And it's where a lot of LGBTQ folks would go to really be able to be themselves. At the time, there were laws in place in New York City that said if you had more than 3 items of clothing belonging to the opposite gender on your person, then you could be arrested and fined. And so what would happen is particularly trans women, trans men, gender expansive folks would go to Stonewall and go to other clubs like it and cross-dress, where they would consider it cross-dressing, but they would trade clothes and then dance and be themselves and have fun and be authentic and experience that pride and resilience. And then if they were raided, they would quickly switch clothes back in the dark so they wouldn't be arrested or reduce the risk that they would be arrested. At some point, you get to the point that you just don't want to put up with it anymore. The riots were also, or the police storming the building, things like that tended to be fairly violent. And at some point, someone threw a brick through a window and started a riot that lasted for 3 days. And at that time, that's what's considered the catalyst for the movement. So a year later, the first organized Pride Parade was put in New York City. And then from there, it just spread throughout the US and also throughout the world. In 1976, 1977, we started to see Pride parades in places like London and Great Britain. And then we have used Pride as a celebration of identity, but also as a political movement, particularly during the 80s and 90s at the height of the AIDS crisis. Activist groups would protest and march at Pride. There's some really striking pictures of ACT UP, which was an AIDS activist organization in the 80s and 90s that's still around, that were marching and wearing all black. They would do demonstrations and as an opportunity to say, no, we're here and we're not going anywhere. We also have been fortunate enough in this area to have Tri-Pride been developed, who held their first Pride Parade, Pride event in 2018 in Johnson City. And I think from what I was told, that was before I moved here, but they expected 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I think over 10,000 people showed up to that event, which is pretty amazing. Unfortunately, the last couple of years it's been canceled due to COVID, but on August 27th, it's coming back and it'll be in Bristol. And the idea is to switch around, Johnson City, Kingsport, Bristol, and be able to celebrate and be able to be ourselves and be who we are, be able to come together and be in community with one another, but then also allow an opportunity for other folks to just explore who they are and explore themselves, which I think is really cool and is really exciting. So I talked about pride, I talked about resilience, right? That resilience, being able to bounce back. We see pride, but pride is also a marker of resilience, being able to stand up and push back against discrimination and oppression. But then we also have the concept of liberation, which often isn't talked about very much. I think we experience pride and we experience resilience as sometimes a little bit more passive, whereas liberation is a very active movement. And then, sorry, I got distracted by the chat there. Molly asked if there's a reason Tri-Pride's not in June. I'm not 100% sure on that one. But then Tori said, and is correct, the Pride Center downtown has a first ever Rainbow Festival on the 25th in Founders Park. So that's a little bit of a different, Pride centered celebration that isn't directly connected to Tri-Pride. I know when I lived in Dallas, we would have our Pride parades and things in August or September, because for some reason, everyone thinks that it's going to be cooler in August or September, and it never is. August is actually sometimes worse than June. So that's the only thing I can think of. Otherwise, I'm not entirely sure. So liberation lets us be who we are and frees us from the oppressive restraints of discrimination and systems of discrimination. So liberation, this is also what separates it between pride and resilience. So pride and resilience are very much Um, they can be community structures, but they're often also just individual structures, right? So like I can have resilience if I experience microaggressions or I experience heterosexism or cissexism. I can find ways and create ways to combat that internally for myself. Liberation is a community movement. It's a community network, and it has to be community led and driven. Because if it's not, we can't do this just by ourselves. That's part of the beauty of Pride as a movement. So not like Pride is the experience, but Pride is the movement, that we can work together as a community. So we can challenge. Liberation directly challenges structures of discrimination. So cis-sexist, if you've heard the term transphobic, cis-sexist is the same thing, but we're talking about structures and even interpersonal experiences, but it's also more fitting and more correct to say cis-sexist and heterosexist instead of transphobic or homophobic, because they're not based in fear, they're based in discrimination. So using cis-sexism, heterosexism, and then genderist, right? Anybody that doesn't fit within the mold of what a man should do, quote unquote, or a woman should do, quote unquote, if you don't fit your culturally assigned gender roles, you can experience gender-based discrimination that's a little bit different than what we traditionally think of as sexism. So liberation lets us directly challenge those structures and also challenge those policies and actions. So when you think about liberation, think about accessibility, think about legislation, think about the language that we use. Liberation is pronouns being normalized, right? Because that allows more equity. Liberation lends itself to equity. Liberation lends itself in the ways that we're able to say my partner rather than my wife, boyfriend, husband, girlfriend, things like that, say my partner and not automatically be clocked as LGBTQ, right? So cisgender or heterosexual folks using the term partner and normalizing that language, that's a factor into liberation as well. Any examples you all can think of liberation that you've seen or that maybe you've experienced?
I wonder if this counts, but part of my organization's we have it's supposed to be I can't think of my words today. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Essentially, I'm part of an organization to support my company and our community around a lot of these liberations, and as far as like gender, sex, race, all of the cross sections. And one of the things that we did that they had been talking about it, but never actually did it. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna actually do this, is put up gender neutral bathrooms in the single stalls, because we had 2 single stalls in our office that were male and female. One had a urinal, one didn't. And I'm like, there's absolutely no reason why it has to be gendered. And so I actually did it. And that, I don't want to say that in particular triggered any more movement within the organization, but it definitely triggered a lot more awareness in the other offices.
Absolutely.
We're across all of the area. So that I was just like, you know what, I'm so tired of this. I'm just going to change it. And I had several kids point it out and just like acknowledge it, which was really cool.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. One thing that I have appreciated, if you go back, 15, 20 years ago, you heard for same-sex couples, people would refer to their partner as their lover. And and I think that had sexual meanings to it, because it did. But I appreciate the fact that there's words that are more inclusive, but also accepted, like partner and spouse, whatever. But that's one thing that I have really felt like has been it's a change that I've definitely noticed.
Mm-hmm. And marriage equality is a liberatory experience, right? Being able to access marriage. And it's interesting. And this is definitely a bird walk and something else for a different presentation on another day. But marriage equality is kind of a misnomer because we don't actually have marriage equality. For folks with disabilities, there is no marriage equality. So that's something that we also tend to lend ourselves, unfortunately, to making progress in some areas while forgetting other folks that maybe might make it quote unquote harder to get that equality. So that's something to keep in mind too, is when you're looking at liberation, look at who's left out, because liberation should include everybody as well. So that was a little bit of a bird walk, but how can you be an accomplice? Okay, so I say accomplice, and I say accomplice very intentionally, which is different than an ally. So when you hear ally and you hear accomplice, I think a lot of times we hear the word ally, right? Well, what does that really mean? If we break down what it means to be an ally says, I support you, right? But it still lends itself to be, I can support you from back there, right? Like I can support you from over here while you're still in the front lines and you're still in danger. Whereas an accomplice says, I stand with you and I'm going to use my power and use my privilege to be able to help protect you and move your needs forward, right? So somebody that has more systemic power, somebody that has more systemic privilege to be able to help things move down the line that and uses that power is an accomplice. One thing that I think about is a great example of this with accomplishing with BIPOC communities is this really powerful picture from a protest that occurred where, of course, police showed up in full riot gear to a nonviolent protest, as we're used to seeing, unfortunately. And there was a Black activist who had a megaphone and was speaking, and of course surrounded by police in riot gear. And a group of white individuals surrounded her and created a barrier between her and the fully armed and geared police officers, and literally put their bodies on the line because they knew that they were less likely to be injured and harmed than she was due to systemic and interpersonal racism and history of police brutality and violence. And that is truly like that's accomplishing, right? Like that's active. That's not saying I'm going to go to this parade or I'm going to go to this protest and I'm going to hold a sign, but instead saying like, no, I'm going to put myself out there the way you're putting yourself out there. And I'm going to do it in a way that protects you and helps protect you. An ally often also is kind of like, I'm going to do what I think is best. Whereas accomplishing is truly asking, what do you need from me? How can I best support you? How can I best move you forward? And then doing that instead of saying, well, here's what I think you need, right? So it's a very active role. And then the whole point of it is that we should be striving to earn that title of an ally or an accomplice. An ally and an accomplice is not something that we give ourselves, right? I don't get to say that I'm an ally to a marginalized community. I say that I work to be allied with, or I work to be complicit in their liberation, rather than I say that myself, I am an ally. Does that make sense? Are y'all with me on that? All right, seeing some nods, so that's good. So what are some ways that you currently or in the future you could think of being an accomplice? So I know Casey said using partner more often, or using partner all the time. There have been a few other things. What else? Casey also talked about the gender neutral door signs, using your pronouns. I see pronouns on the screen for some folks, which is also a part to normalize pronoun usage.
Mickey, when we're thinking about how someone can be an ally or accomplice to LGBTQIA folks, there are a few things that I can think of that folks have done for me, right, in my history. And one thing people have done for me in the past is scout bathrooms, right? So I need to know what it's going to look like on the other side of the door before I walk into it. And so having a cis male do that work for me. And then when what's on the other side of the door is not safely walled stalls, that cis male being the one to go talk to the restaurant owner or the bar owner or the wherever owner, right, to say this is an issue, instead of me going and saying this is an issue, has been something that has been really valuable to me. There have been other times where I've been undergoing surgeries, and folks have volunteered to be the ones that orchestrated the meal train, or the cleaning of my dishes, or the sweeping of my floors, or organized my to and fro's to doctor's appointments, right, where I didn't have to, I was coordinating enough, right? So folks did that coordination on my behalf and thought to ask to do that for me. And I found that to be that those folks were accomplices to me.
Absolutely. Another great way is being aware of legislation, right? Being aware of what legislation is on the table and checking in, right? Checking in with folks. How are you doing with this? How can I support you? I always see things on Facebook from quite a few of my friends that they post on Trans Day of Visibility or Trans Day of Pride. If you've ever misgendered me, Venmo me $5, right? And then it starts off as a joke, but then there are actually some people that will do that. And it's always kind of interesting and just kind of a fun quip there, so to speak. Normalize asking pronouns, which is absolutely crucial. And another way to really act as an accomplice or really act as an ally is correct people who misgender or who dead name, even when the person's not in the room, especially when the person's not in the room, because that's something that we need to be doing that work to help change that system. Joanne says, make it a standard part of our resource sharing and health and safety group conversations for all students who are exploring and preparing for study abroad. Absolutely. Make sure that you're talking about, what does this look like for you? What is this going to look like with your identities when you go to this place that may not be safe? I talk to my students who identify as LGBTQIA+ about, what is this like for you? What's this going to be like for you as a counselor, right? How are you going to navigate clients who have differing views or who maybe make disparaging comments, or clients that may not know your identity? How do you go about that disclosure process? What does that look like? Being willing and able to talk about it. And then, of course, I have some other examples, so including LGBTQIA+ people in your decision-making and policy-making. So it always goes back to the phrase, nothing for us without us. That comes from the disability rights movement, but has been also used across marginalized groups fighting for equity and liberation. be willing to take risk, right? So it may not be safe. Another way to take risks that I see with allyship is if someone is misgendered by a superior, so by a boss or a chair or something like that, it may not feel safe, or it may not even be safe for them to correct that person. So for someone else to correct that person, pull them aside or correct them in the moment, that's, be willing to take that risk, be willing to have that uncomfortable conversation, because yes, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yes, it may feel weird for you, but it's not going to have that same emotional toll that it will for the person who's experiencing the harm by being misgendered. What's in your display and what's in your office, right? Having a pride flag. I've got a Progress Pride flag hanging by my door. I've got a couple other rainbow things in my office. What's being shown in your email? What's being shown in your office? How are you showing yourself to be somebody that people can talk to? Believing LGBTQIA people's experiences. So even if it doesn't necessarily make sense to you, like you don't really understand why someone is upset, believe marginalized individuals' experiences. This also goes for folks with other marginalized identities. Believe that when somebody says this doesn't feel right, that it doesn't feel right. Really, really kind of, just because it doesn't make sense to you why someone's upset doesn't negate their feelings and experiences. Being vocal about your support, and then donate time, money, and energy as you can to LGBTQIA plus causes, right? We're not just doing this for clout on the gram. We're not just doing this to be able to get kudos and accolades from other people. We need to be doing this work even when no one's going to see it or recognize it. Something else that is kind of interesting that are like other pieces is like, try to think about pieces where you see things missing. So if you notice, for example, there hasn't been a place for ETSU business cards to have pronouns, ask some questions. Why is that? Why aren't there pronouns? How can we add pronouns? Talk to legislators or talk to insurance. If anybody has any connects to like higher up HR, more of the Tennessee systems HR, gender affirming care is not covered by state of Tennessee insurance. And that's a problem because federally it should be. Per federal guidelines, it should be. So I don't have the power to do that. Somebody else in this room may have connections to people who do. Use that power, ask questions. As we start recognizing these ways that we can do this, we start really being able to build that resilience and build that pride. And then also expand your friendships, right? Expand your social circle. Susan said you ordered business cards with pronouns. That I think that is a new change. Hopefully it's one that everybody has access to. I know they were moving away from dynamic forms or whatever it was to order. But I know to get pronouns on my business card, I went back and forth with the office a little bit until they finally put it. But yeah, those things change so small, but it's really important to me to have pronouns on my cards, right? And so being able to find ways to do that. So we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. I do want to say thank you, and I'll leave my contact info there for a second, and I can also stick it in the chat. But I'm curious, other thoughts and other questions that you all have.
So I'll ask a question. I am new on campus, and I'm just curious about our policies or maybe not policies, but practices and housing and residence life for students who are in transition and Yeah, how do we work with our students there?
It's a really good question. I don't know the specific policy. Like I think the policy is one of those, they really do it on a case by case basis rather than having a blanket policy, which is pretty common for a lot of universities. I do know that there are trans students that have been able to room with, have roommates that are of their gender identity rather than being forced to room with someone of a different identity. But we also, I mean, we don't have necessarily yet, maybe one day in the future, but kind of an LGBT dorm space. Like that would be really cool to have. Like that's something that would be really neat. The Pride Center has been really important and has grown quite a bit just in the last couple of years. That just started a couple of years ago and has been able to do some cool stuff and will continue to do cool stuff now that we're not quite as isolated and everything's virtual. But yeah, just asking about those policies, trying to figure out like, who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to connect with? And then doing that. Because that's something too that I think a lot of students, even if we had the capability to do that, it's exhausting because it also takes that emotional toll.
Great, thank you.
One thing I just wanted to add, and kind of a promo thing, one thing that really kind of struck me about a year and a half ago was I met so many people from the community who had moved to Johnson City. Most had never heard of Johnson City. Most had never heard of ETSU. And suddenly they're here and trying to find a way to get connected in the community. And so we started a faculty staff LGBTQ association, which a lot of you on the screen are part of. And, to help build connections and just to kind of help people feel. I think that's one thing I think we can do within the community is help connect each other. And it's been great, made some great friends, but also just help people realize there is a really vibrant community here. And so I'm putting something in the chat. We actually have an event tomorrow night. Some of you are as RSVP for already. But anyway, that's something that I think has really helped me, was helping just to want to bring people together and to realize that, we're here. So I put something in the chat. If anybody wants to attend, just email me or whatever.
There was also, so Molly just answered it. So Patricia, folks who receive SSDI, so Social Security Disability benefits, that often also they receive money, but they also often receive healthcare that is crucial to receiving services and access to services. If they get married, more often than not, folks with disabilities lose those benefits because the partner's income then is expected to take over. And unfortunately, corporate insurance, private insurance with deductibles, copays, all of that, like healthcare gets exorbitantly expensive, as I think we can all agree it just is in general. And so a lot of folks with disabilities, they can get married, but if they do get married, they're at high risk of losing their benefits. And there are actually folks that later become disabled or who are disabled but are married that get legally divorced in order to be able to get health care, so they can live. And that's something that when marriage equality was passed, we didn't have a lot of discussions about. All right, so I know we're right at time, but I also want to encourage you to reach out to me with thoughts or questions. I know there was a lot of info here, a lot of things here, and a lot of other things I could have talked about or could have expanded more on. But there's always the limits of time. So equity and inclusion, thank you all for having me and inviting me to do this. This has been really meaningful.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. This was an excellent conversation. Would like to go ahead and invite everyone to join us next month on July 12th. Dr. Georgita Washington will be leading a discussion on the impact of COVID-19, a holistic perspective. We'll also be sending an email evaluation out. If you could go ahead and complete that, that would help us in future planning. But thank you again so much, and thank you all for joining us today.
You have a great week and an evening.